Hey, you guys, welcome for joining. All right, let's see if we can go live on here. All right, welcome you guys. We'll get started in just a little bit. Hey, welcome you guys. We'll get started in just a quick minute. Hey, good evening, you guys. I'm going to see if Facebook will cooperate. Doesn't look like we'll be going live. So let me real quick tell the Facebook community that we are only on Zoom tonight. I don't know why Facebook is so fickle. I will let them know where everyone else, if they're struggling to join us, let me real quick tell them to jump on the Zoom. But we got some important and good information coming tonight. But no worries, guys. I'm going to be recording it on here, and we'll be uploading it to our Facebook page and to recently put stuff on YouTube in case any of you guys like to binge watch stuff on there. Apparently that's a thing these days. All right. Let's. All right. Hey, look, guys, thank you so much for joining us tonight. So thank you for joining us. It's a lovely Tuesday night. So real quick, my name is Courtney Fricke. I run Northshore REIA. We put on a handful of these events right now because of COVID. They're, online webinars. And honestly, guys, I'm paying attention. I want us to be able to meet in person as soon as it's safe to do so. So I was literally talking to someone about that yesterday, about seeing when we can do that. I know it'll be good to see you guys' faces at an event whenever we can, but nonetheless, we'll keep doing these webinars. And so just a little bit about Northshore REIA. You guys, we're the Real Estate Investors Association for the North Shore, but we really service a lot of the Southeast Louisiana and even part of Mississippi. We have people frequently come from all over. These events are free. They're open to the public, and they are, the goal is just to raise the tide of education of the investor community in our area. So I'm constantly just trying to bring relevant topics to you guys. And so I know that this is one that has been asked about. People are always asking questions about, about having an LLC, just different questions of how they should be doing different things, whether that is a wholesale deal or a buy and hold rental or flip. So these are some great topics we're going to hit tonight. We have some other ones coming up, but generally speaking, these events, the goal is that I'm bringing either local and regional people who can speak specifically to Louisiana, or people who are very informed and very experienced on topics to come and speak on certain things. The goal is for it to not to be a pitch fest where something's being sold to you, but to bring people that can help you in your business, right? So, and that's a lot of thanks to our local sponsors that helps make this, because at the end of the day is, I have no desire. If any of you guys are here in the beginning, we started off having a small membership fee. I have no desire for any of that stuff. That stuff's for the birds. At least just for me, I was just having the meetings and having to say, okay, are you a member or not? Like, I ain't got time for that. So one of the things is I want to say a big thank you to all of our sponsors. And so if you don't know who those are, these are people who are in our local area, who service our area. And these are people that frequently a lot of people do business with here. So actually Bob and Fleur de, they are sponsors. They've been very helpful for educating the real estate investor community. Bob's a Real Estate Specific CPA, and John, he's one of the attorneys for Fleur de Title, which has locations all over this region. And I know I do frequently do my deals. I had just closed one on Friday. I'm doing another closing this week with them. So they are, they always deal with my crazy deals. So, and Bob helps keeps me straight when it comes to the accounting part of it, right? And so these are just people. Investing is a team sport. And so it's getting people around you to help you get closer to your goals. Some of the other sponsors we have are people like Christina Ruska, who is a lender with Loan Depot. I know she's been swamped with refinances and helping people qualify for loans right now during COVID. You've got Mia Rogers, who's an investor, but also a licensed agent in Mississippi and Louisiana. You've got Quest Trust Company. That's a self-directed IRA company. They're phenomenal. You've got Wayne Sanji and Associates, their property management company. They're also a brokerage, which for some of you guys, if you're landlords or you're looking to hang your license with someone, they're not bad people to consider, especially if you're thinking about rentals and you have your license. It could be an opportunity to learn underneath them. We've got people like Justin Harris, who's a land wholesaler. And let's see, we've got Ryan Carrier, who's with Total Construction Renovation, who's a local contractor who is a flipper himself. I know a lot of people are always asking about a good contractor. If you want someone to oversee your flip or even to help do some renovations either around your own home or you're just in general, maybe it's like a turnover with a rental, something to look at too. But so yeah, I always have to go through and count them, did I get them all? But because that's a huge part of real estate. It's the whole team that's all around you, right? And so at the end of the day, it is a crazy time we're living in. I don't know about you guys. A lot of people have been fixing up their house. They've been doing things like that. But one of the biggest things, I know a lot of people have been getting caught up on projects. So I don't know if that's any of you guys. Hasn't been me. Actually, right here, you can see some project lists, like honey-do lists that I put out in the beginning of the shutdown. I have maybe only, crossed off 2 of them because life got really busy for me. But the whole idea is there's a lot of people who are getting a lot of things done right now. And one of those things is looking at your LLCs or, creating one or tightening up the ones that you have. So this might be a good time for you to really look at what's going on and see how you can improve it. So there's a few announcements I have before I go and hand it over to John. But first of all, we've got some upcoming webinars. If any of you guys know who Steve Trang is, Steve Trang, he's the host of the Real Estate Disruptors podcast. He's based out of Arizona. The guy is phenomenal. I met him last October in Biloxi at an event and that we were speaking at, and the guy's a great educator. Not everyone's really phenomenal as far as just really taking a topic and educating well on it, but he's one of those he's just phenomenal. And a lot of you have been asking me about private money. We did one event already this year, but I know that it's a dense topic. So I brought him to come speak on how to understand about raising private money, using private money. And so he's coming this Thursday. We're gonna do a webinar. It's from 6 to 7:30 p.m. So it's gonna be limited. And if that's a topic that interests you, definitely register for it. Go however you found out about this event. Go, if I can, I'll go and put it in the chat. But we have other topics coming up. Hopefully next week, we'll have at least one webinar next week. And so look, if you miss any of these, we do record them and we put them on YouTube. Just look up Northshore REIA on YouTube. You should be able to find it. Two more things. We mute all of you guys upon entry. Even though it's a Zoom event, we're just trying to limit the distractions because it's about the content coming across. But if you've got questions, put them in the chat box. The best thing I'm going to say is we're going to ask people to hold off on your questions because we're going to address those questions at the end. So we've got John who's going to share first, and then we've got Bob who's going to share. So John's a real estate specific, he's a real estate attorney. And then you've got Bob who's a real estate specific CPA. They're going to come and bring their different unique approaches to entities. And then at the end, I'm going to open up the last 30 minutes from 8 to 8:30 to see any questions you guys have. And this is a great time to utilize this platform to ask them, okay? So make note of your question down on the Zoom at the bottom where it says chat. Type your questions out there, and what I'll do is I'm gonna ask them and help moderate that toward the end, make sure we get your questions answered. So don't forget, if you're interested in Thursday's webinar, sign up for that. And lastly, some of you guys may have known, but what we have is recently, I've had the privilege to join Paul LaGrange on the radio. And so on Saturdays from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. on WWL, so it's, talk show, which locally, a lot of people know WWL. So that's either 870 a.m. or that's 105.3 FM. But Paul has had the home improvement 15 years. They contacted him after Katrina, said, hey, people need to fix their houses. And so that is on, it's a recurring show just about every Saturday from 11 to 1. And Paul, he answers questions. If you say, hey, look, I've got this issue with my AC or my foundation or, my windows or whatever. And he'll do his best to take his 30 years of experience as a contractor to answer that. And I've been honored to jump on. And so I've actually been on there the last few Saturdays, and I plan to be on there for the coming Saturdays, just answering questions about real estate in general. Most of the stuff it's part of real estate that you can't fix with a hammer. So if you guys want to tune in, I love getting to listen to the show at any time, just because it helps me learn more about real estate and houses. So again, so that's WWL. So that's 870 a.m. or 105.3 FM on Saturdays from 11 to 1. You can also go to radio.com app to listen to it for the last 24 hours to play back. So say you miss it, you can go on Sunday morning and listen as long as it's within 24 hours. Or you can listen to their website in case you're, just listening from your phone. All right, so I'm gonna shut up because I've been talking and giving you guys some announcements, but without further ado, this is an important question. I'm just gonna ask you again, write down any questions that you have because these guys are gonna be here to answer your questions and to really try to help you guys get fully equipped to do your real estate investing business. I know John and Bob have helped me. I was actually on my drive from the office. I kind of left a little bit late to get home for the webinar, but I was counting in my head. I have eight or something entities that I'm at now. And when I started out, I had just one and I did everything out of that one. And I have since learned that that is not the best way to go about doing it. So I'm looking forward for you guys to get to hear what these guys have to share. And without further ado, I want to welcome John Stevens with Fleur League Title.
Hey, thank you, Courtney. All right. Can you hear me? Courtney, good? Yeah, volume's good? All right. Yeah. First and foremost, thank you for the opportunity to come and speak, Courtney, virtually. It's a lot of fun always to work with you, Bob. You're a great man. I want to do what we always try to do at Fleur League, which is to help you achieve your goals. And I know Courtney mentioned that earlier, and I just want to stress that. That is what we're here to do. We're here to be a resource for y'all. All right. To that end, I'm going to do my best to give you a clear and comprehensive 30,000-foot view, right? Maybe a little more detail of the LLC world and how it kind of applies to real estate investment. Like Courtney said, I am a real estate specific attorney, obviously at Fleur title. Before that, I was a litigation attorney for the most part. Also did significant amount of estate planning and succession stuff. So we've seen how these types of business entities operate in a vast array of venues, from just real life, obviously, day-to-day operations, to what happens when something goes wrong with a company, or there's a quarrel amongst the members, et cetera. So we want to help you protect yourselves in that regard. First and foremost, it is what it sounds like, right? What's one of the most appealing and I guess traditionally appealing aspects of a limited liability company? It limits the liability, right? It limits liability of the members. All righty. That is one of the certainly obviously most important factors. What we're dealing with here is to insulate yourselves as business people, right, from any undue or unwanted liabilities that may arise, not necessarily certainly will arise, but may arise. All right, that's one of the advantages. I'll go into kind of some scenarios of where that limited liability is beneficial in some real life scenarios. Otherwise, another obvious added benefit, you have flexibility, all right, with LLCs. Flexibility tax-wise, which obviously Bob is the expert on, and I will defer to him entirely on that. But also application-wise, okay? You can use your LLCs in a multitude of different ways. You just heard Courtney say she's got about 8 of them now, right? They can be different types of tools, okay? You can run them and operate them each differently according to your intentions, what you want them to accomplish. You can use them to engage into other business ventures, right? While leaving 1 or 2 of your other businesses out of that. And in doing so, you get to articulate exactly the construct of what that venture might be, right? And again, we'll talk about a little bit later about layering and insulating yourself even more liability-wise. Another benefit, and again, we're going to get into each of these a little bit more, but operating agreements, right? These are the contracts that dictate how the LLC is going to be operated. All right, there are default laws in Louisiana, default LLC laws, that absent a written operating agreement or an oral operating agreement, but generally they're written, the default rules will apply. As long, in Louisiana, you have a pretty broad ability to contract. Okay, as long as you're not breaking the law and as long as it's not against public policy, right, it's pretty much going to fly. So you can use that breadth in your operating agreements to, again, articulate exactly what the expectations of the members are, right? What the managerial expectations are, and those different types of facets of business. And again, we'll get a little bit more detail about that. Another one that my partner and I, who just poked his head in, not sure where he disappeared to, he and his daughter, we tend to kind of preach on and really emphasize, just out of a matter of, I think, good business merit, is that LLCs help legitimize your business endeavors. You come up with your LLC, you have your business. Yes, you may be a business person that participates in real estate investment deals. You may be a realtor who's a 1099, right, participant in a brokerage. You get that LLC in place, you've got your business in place. There comes with that a perception, I think, of the people that you're going to do deals with, and the public generally, right, that you are conducting a legitimate business enterprise there. And then we'll get into this in a little bit, but we'll go ahead and dive into it now because it has to do with the limitation of liability. Before I hop there, Jared, you want to add anything?
Well, sounds good. I think that John's right. A lot, we have people call us often where they hold properties in LLCs, and before they realize that there's a real reason and purpose behind that, something happens and they can be subject to liability. And the purpose of those things is to insulate yourself and separate your personal assets from anything that you do within your business. And several different reasons that John's going to go over that the LLC can serve, but that main purpose is to insulate yourself from liability. And I think Bob is probably going to touch on how you can maintain the separateness between your personal business and the real estate business, which is also hugely important. But the LLC and the limitation of liability is huge. And I think John's done a good job of touching on that so far.
I appreciate it, buddy. That's my partner in crime there, Jared Miguez, Florida title. All right. First and foremost, again, main thing that blares out at you when you talk about LLCs is the limitation of liability. All right. Case in point, recently had somebody come into the office, has a good book of real estate investment business. Truly, has gotten a good start over these past few years. Made some good business moves and some good business decisions. One of the things, that's my cohort. Thanks, dear. Thank you, smart. All right. One of the things that he came to us for was because he has recently purchased a piece of property that has, unbeknownst to him, right, a black mold issue. Okay, and there are tenants living in it. Now, his approach to this property, without knowing this, was that it was probably going to be a long-term hold, right? Now he's got a situation where he's got tenants in a property with black mold, right, that he could be subject to a claim for, because that's a potential personal injury claim. And I'll tell you what, those claims are being litigated more and more. It is an expanding area of litigation and personal injury claim and tort claim. So it's a real life deal, right? This gentleman, again, made some, had a good portfolio, and he does, and he will maintain that, but he purchased these properties in his personal name. He's not insulated necessarily, or a person in that situation, depending on the circumstances, might not be insulated entirely from liability, despite not knowing, right, what type of hazard their property might display or risk to the tenants, right? So put that in a property in an LLC. Really, you need to start from the beginning. You need to enter into the purchase agreement as an LLC, signing on behalf of the LLC, and the property itself is acquired in the LLC to begin with, such that any claim that arises thereafter, right, is only a claim against the LLC. We'll talk a little while about how to make sure that that's the only claim available. But again, personal injury type cases, what you want to do is you want to keep only your business assets within the LLC and your personal assets outside of it, like Jared mentioned, so that, let's say, these people have serious injury and a claim is made against the owner of the property. Well, if it's in an LLC, they can only go after what that LLC has as assets, okay? And you're gonna more than likely, obviously, want to have insurance policies in place as well, so there could be insurance in place. That's all fine and good, but you also, again, you never know what type of coverage issues might come out, all right, or come up. So having it in an LLC and having that LLC either own only that asset, that property, or maybe one more, is going to limit the reach of what that person can attack as far as satisfying any type of judgment that might arise. So that's a personal injury type of a real life scenario that you might see. There's financial industry. Look, let's face it, not necessarily every deal that you enter into or in the history of the world that anyone's ever into has gone perfectly well, right? Sometimes deals just go wrong for unforeseen reasons. It might be that something on an inspection was missed. There's terrible termite damage that you might not have known about. An otherwise golden opportunity in this piece of property might not be exactly what you think it is. Look, hey, sometimes clerks of court misrecord stuff. Hey, let's say there was an abstract done and a mortgage was inadvertently canceled and it doesn't show up on an abstract. Well, then you just bought yourself a piece of property that might have a $100,000 lien against it, right? Complicated issues, obviously, but again, a situation where maybe your deal doesn't go as planned, and if a creditor claim is made against you for some reason or against the property, okay, if only that property in the LLC or maybe one more, right? Again, that's going to limit the availability of assets for a claimant to be able to attack or attach their claim to in order to satisfy judgments. Jared, want to add to that at all?
No, I think that you never know how the situation is going to go, and I think a lot of people get discouraged by the cost of what an LLC is what it's going to cost to set all those things up. And when you actually get down to the brass tacks and look at the cost of doing actually getting your affairs in order before you close, it's worth the protection you're going to get at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And then another thing that probably comes up, and there might be people asking, hey, look, if I start an LLC right now and I want to fund or get lending for this acquisition, how are they going to underwrite me as an LLC? It's a good question. A lot of times LLC has advantageous LLCs too, right? Particularly newer ones that you can't show a lot of P&Ls for. But there are ways to handle that acquisition, depending on the lender you work with, depending on the people you work with on the legal end, to get it set up into your LLC as quickly and as efficiently as possible, with everything intact loan-wise, okay? So I imagine, like Jerry said, people often ask the cost, what will it cost me? In not just hard costs out of the pocket, but hey, what is it going to, how is it going to affect my eligibility for qualification for loan status? So moving on to the next thing I talked about briefly at the beginning, the flexibility of LLCs, okay? And again, Bob will definitely touch on, I imagine, the tax structures of LLCs, your flexibility, how you can choose that, and what all that entails. He's the expert, undoubtedly, when it comes to Internal Revenue Code. And so we'll let him do that. Some things that I was thinking about talking about how we have helped people, our investors in the past, with their LLCs, Courtney being one of them, who again mentioned that she has several and for various purposes. You can have LLCs to again do different things. Okay, you can have a LLC like we just talked about that's going to own a piece of property or multiple properties, right? You can have non-asset holding LLCs that are just going to be your asset management company, which you would get into the that management expectation and that managerial administrative stuff that I was talking about earlier with the operating agreement. There are ways to even further limit liability by creating layering in that respect, right? Okay, let's have the several LLCs hold the properties, where we have one LLC manage those properties, and that LLC that's managing it doesn't necessarily have to be a member of it, depending on how you set up each LLC, right? And if a claim is made against that management company for some way, shape, or form, well, it doesn't hold any assets, right? And so as long as you're operating it legitimately, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, the claims are going to be pretty difficult to come by. There's not going to be much by way of assets to attack for a claim. Another thing we do a lot, joint venture agreements between LLCs. Okay, you can have your LLC, whether or not it holds assets or not, it could participate with somebody else's LLC. oh, look, let's team up with this, with each other on this, looks like a good opportunity investment wise. I don't necessarily want to let that person be a member of my LLC, right, and have an ownership stake in that LLC. But what I can do is I can partner up without perhaps technically creating a partnership for legal reasons, but I can team up with this other person's LLC, and he don't want me or she don't want me to be a member of hers, but we can still take on this joint venture to accomplish something, and we could set forth in a joint venture agreement, right, our expectations in detail such that the parties understand what each LLC's role is and what each stands to gain. So those
I'll
yeah.
piggyback on that, John. I know when I worked in the city for a little while, and I helped somebody set up an LLC where one of the members was the capital contributing member, and the other one was going to put in a lot of sweat equity. And the person who had put in the capital wanted to assure that that other member was actually going to do the job and the tasks that were discussed and agreed upon at the beginning of the process. So we put in place a employment agreement that was supplemental to the operating agreement and the articles of organization that required that sweat equity member to accomplish certain tasks and do certain things. And if those things weren't satisfied, then the other member could then remove that person. There's actually 3 people involved, so so the voting interests were easier to come by. But 2 members had sweat equity, and the other one put in the capital. And each of the members' responsibilities were laid out clearly. Obviously, the capital contributing member's role was clear, putting up capital for this investment or for this project, and the other 2 are going to do some work. What's the work that's required? It's listed in detail on that employment agreement, and all is referenced in the operating agreement. So you can easily reference benchmarks and requirements for each member. So when John says you can broadly contract when it comes to creating an LLC and then establishing an operating agreement, you can do that and set expectations for, somebody who like Courtney, who wants to go out and do a lot of these real estate transactions, boots on the ground, but she wants to work with different investors. She can create benchmarks she's going to hit to justify receiving that capital from people.
Yeah, good points. And so kind of in that same vein, as far as what your operating agreement is. All right, like I mentioned earlier, there are default LLC laws in Louisiana that will govern how a LLC is to operate absent a operating agreement. Okay, you have the flexibility to change that up, again, as long as it's lawful and not against public policy, to determine amongst the members how the LLC is going to be administered, how it's going to be managed. Like Jared said, who's putting what up, right? And what are they getting out of it? Okay. In addition to that, an operating agreement can serve really well. And I'll back up real quick. Always know, some people might think, well, look, it's just going to be me. I know how I'm going to, make all the money, all the profits going to come to me, right? Why do I need to mess around with the tedium of an operating agreement and expectations amongst members if I'm the only member? And that's a reasonable point, right? But one of the things you can do with an operating agreement that is really going to help out if you don't have any other plans in place or documents in place as it might relate to estate plans and things like that, are the triple Ds, the 3 Ds, okay, that an operating agreement, even for single member entities, LLCs, is really beneficial. Death, divorce, and disability, okay? So by default in Louisiana, if I'm a single member LLC and I die, if I don't have, absent some other provision in a legally binding document such as a will, okay, my interest in my LLC is going to go to my heirs, whomever that might be, and they are only going to be assignees of the LLC, not actual members, okay? Big difference being voting ability and authorization, frankly, to act or the inability to act on behalf of the LLC. All right, an assignee does not have the authority to act on behalf of the LLC. Therefore, if something happens to me and my wife inherits my interest in my LLC as an assignee, it gets stuck in limbo. Okay, and there are institutions that might require certain authority, right? There are banks, lenders, whatever the case might be, right, that need to rely on someone with managerial authority to take action on behalf of that LLC. So death obviously is one. Disability, okay, if you become disabled, right, who's going to be able to manage in your absence? I'm sorry, y'all, if you hear my son trying to break down the door out there. He's a 2-year-old, but he really is into LLC law, so he's trying to get in on it. But disability, right? If you're no longer able to manage or perform your management duties under the LLC, again, who's going to have the authority to step into your place and act as an attorney of fact to do that? You can set forth that provisionally in your operating agreement. All right. And then divorce. Okay. It's something we never want to happen, obviously. Louisiana being a default community property state, if you acquire an interest in an LLC while you're married, notwithstanding a separate property agreement, it's going to be community property, right? So 1/2 yours, 1/2 your spouse's. You can really, get into a little bit more planning, a little bit more understanding as to what's going to happen with that interest if divorce were to happen. Okay, we do that all the time, not in any foreboding sense, but just as a matter of fact, a matter of business. Because I've been involved in litigation where it wasn't adequate. There was an operating agreement, but that part of it was not adequately addressed, and it was tied up in litigation for years and years as it related to this LLC interest of this couple that was getting divorced. I mean, and each of them spent tens of thousands of dollars litigating over this because it was a successful business. So you can outline those types of things in an operating agreement that help just with the fluidity and the good health overall of your business. Jared, anything on operating agreements?
Sounds good. You're nailing it.
All right. All right. Another thing, and Jared, I'm not sure, I think you were in on it when I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things he and I, again, talk a bunch about to people is just the perception of legitimate business that an LLC is going to provide the people that you're going to do business with the opportunity to see, okay? And that is not a dig on anyone's business abilities, right? Or their underlying legitimacy as a business person. But again, this day and age, image is a lot. Okay, it just is. It's that's a fact of, I think, capitalism. You get your LLC in place, you're official. You get your tax ID number, right? You get your bank account. You get your marketing materials. It's more than likely, depending on how you set up the name. If it's something that you want goodwill to be perceived with, right? A name of a business might be more attractive sometimes than your regular name, right? John D. Stevens isn't all that cool. It doesn't sound as cool as Fleur de Lis title, right? So that's just the nature of the being. And I think it's also kind of self-inspiring in a sense, where okay, I've got my business established, right? Let's get these things done. So again, I think there's a perception of legitimacy that kind of lends itself to the idea of a manifest destiny type of thing, maybe on a microcosmic level, but in the sense that, right, it legitimizes you, it legitimizes your enterprise. Jared, to that point, because I know we talk about that a lot.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, especially as a real estate investor where a lot of people are quote unquote call themselves investors. For somebody to walk in a room in a meeting with somebody and say, I represent, Miguez Property Management LLC, we own 25 properties and we're looking to acquire 15 more. That sounds a lot better than Jared Miguez walking in saying, hey, look, I'm trying to get into this business. Let me try to do some creative financing with you. And I don't really have a ton of experience. It feels more official whenever you walk in with an LLC setup. And that, to that point, I think, and John, if you're going to talk about this in a second, just go ahead and stop me. But that kind of plays in my mind into how you create and keep the separateness of your personal business and your real estate business. So, the part of that limited liability comes from having a separate name and entity, and also having separate bank accounts and functioning and keeping those things separate. And what I mean by that is, John and I, part of our process, once we establish an LLC for somebody, we give them their tax identification number and their articles of organization. They use that documentation and information to go to the bank to open a bank account. And that bank account should be used for only business expenses. Any income that you receive pertaining to your business goes into that account. Any expenses you have related to that business goes out of that account. And then as an owner, you're going to withdraw payments and pay yourself, quote unquote, for the work that you're doing in that business. But first and foremost, the income comes in there, the expenses go out of that account, and then you transfer the income part of it to yourself. And that is on a basic level, maintaining your separateness. And some people get caught up in the fact that it's more of an administrative burden. But if you want to maintain the liability protection that an LLC provides, you have to follow some basic rules. And Bob's going to be able to go into that, I'm sure, in detail. And if he doesn't, we can piggyback off of that and discuss that towards the end. But the legitimacy that comes from creating your LLC, establishing a name, creating a bank account, handling your business as a business, it gives you a sense of professionalism that and it carries you to another level than individually dabbling as a hobby in real estate investing.
And so, Jared, to that point too, so you mentioned like administrative headache, and that's one of the things we always talk to clients about, because a lot of times one of the questions comes up is, hey, how many properties should I hold in my LLC? And there's no necessarily black and white answer for that, right? There's no formula per se. What we tell people is it depends on the level of administrative, quote unquote, headache that you're willing to endure and accommodate in order to, increase more liability or increase better liability protection, right? So the more LLCs you have, the more of them you have to run legitimately, the more operating accounts that you have, right? The more accounting that you have to do. But this day and age, it's not too terribly difficult, to get your account set up. Everything's online through the bank, right? You can track with spreadsheets these days, incoming and outgoing expenses and revenue, right? Again, Bob's got probably some better ideas money-wise because he's the money man, but it's all about balance, right? You striking a balance and what's comfortable. Now, that being said, I would encourage people probably never to have any more than 4. That's probably pushing it. I always say 2-ish, 3-ish, depends on if they're long-term holds or short-term holds. So that kind of, again, relates back to the flexibility of the positional LLCs and how they apply them. And the reason here's the whole impetus, right, to making sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's, is you are trying to prevent a claimant from piercing the corporate veil. All right, you might have heard that before. What does that mean? It means, hey, if I'm not running my business like a legitimate business and I'm spending it and using the money that's in there, using it more of a piggy bank, right? Then there are going to be some angles that at least a claimant will try to make to say, hey, they're not running this as a legitimate business. Why should they be protected and limited from liability, right? Whether it's allegations of fraud and whether it's intentional or not, right? You want to insulate that argument of piercing the corporate veil, because that's what really gives us the sanctity of the LLC. So you just want to be mindful. It's a responsibility, but certainly not one that anyone who's watching this right now who has the mindfulness to get on board about learning something like this can't handle. Okay, without a doubt. Otherwise, just some easy tidbits. Jared mentioned earlier, what are the costs, right? Upstart costs are not much in Louisiana getting your LLC started. As far as Secretary of State fees, you have to pay a $30 annual report fee to, make sure your information data is up to date with the Secretary of State, so that you remain active. Other than that, right, you're going to want your registered agent and a business address in Louisiana, which are all things that you talk about and think about whenever you're getting this thing started. And these are all things that we talk in depth with our clients, even the ones who've been with us through multiple LLCs, right? Each one is kind of a new canvas, so to speak. And so you can really, you get into the details with it. And, this is really, like I said, intended to be a higher view. You can, there's a lot of nuanced stuff that goes into this, which is why none of this is intended to be legal advice. All right. This is intended to give you an idea of what exists and what the LLCs are intended to do and how you can use them in your business ventures. So with that in mind, we're always here and available as a resource, like I said, because at the end of the day, we want to help you accomplish your goals, because that's going to help us accomplish our goals, okay? To be perfectly frank, but we're not going to be able to do that if we're not any good at what we do, which is why we hold ourselves to high standards as far as our legal counsel and good nature, I hope. But that's all I could think of. Jared, you want to caboose with anything?
Yeah, last thing I'll say is that Courtney can vouch for us when it comes to the fact that, like John said, every transaction and every situation is a blank canvas. But once we create some processes around your work, we can it can get a little bit more streamlined, and you can and once we create and different types of transactions will require different legal advice and legal services. But generally, when you're setting up your LLC, you call us and say, hey, I want to start another LLC to buy another property. That is something that once we've gotten your information a few times, we can verify a few things, and that process can be simpler and more efficient on our end, which is something that John and I do for a lot of our clients that we do a lot of business for. I mean, I can name 5 or 6 different off the top of my head that we created some sort of system, and we know how they like to handle their wholesale transactions and their assignment transactions and how they like their contracts drafted and how they want their businesses set up. Those types of things we can get systematic with, but we always take an approach that, let's make sure this situation is the same as it was before. If we're not, we're going to try to create this success around this new file at work, the opportunity we have going.
That nails it. That nails on the head. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you, John and Jared.
Bob or Courtney?
Yeah, we're going to go on over to Bob in a quick second. But John and Jared are going to be here with Bob on the back end to answer questions, because I know some of you are thinking about certain things. But without further ado, let's bring up Bob. He's going to talk about from the CPA standpoint. Let me make sure you are, Bob, you're unmuted. Good. Okay. All right. Bring it on up.
All right, great. Thanks, Courtney. And thanks, Jared and John. That was a good discussion on LLCs. One of the interesting things about entities is the LLC is the most flexible one, especially for real estate investing, and from the way the tax laws work. It's the best one for holding real estate for long-term holds. But because it's so flexible, you can also use it for any business. And as your business grows, there are some tax strategies you can use to elect to be taxed as an S Corp, for instance, and to save a little bit on your SE tax and control how much that is. SE tax is self-employment tax, which is Social Security and Medicare taxes. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, the other thing to think about is that there are 3 basic tax structures in the system when it comes to businesses, and that's a corporation, a partnership, and a sole proprietor. With an LLC, because it's so new, those LLCs were created in 1977, so they've only been around for a little over 40 years. And when they were first created, the IRS didn't really know what to do with them. And so they basically said, well, it depends on how many members the LLC has. We'll treat it like another entity that we already have in the tax code. So if it's a single member LLC, you're treated as a sole proprietor. which means that your LLC is disregarded for taxes. So you don't have to file a separate tax return for it. If you have more than one member, then you're treated as a partnership. You're required to file a tax return for that. And then, but the income flows through to the 2 members or 3 members or 15 or 100 members, however many you have. Based on what the operating agreement says. So especially when you move into multiple members, operating agreement becomes very important. But the IRS also allowed LLCs to elect to be taxed as an S corp or a corporation. And so that's something to talk to your tax advisor with, depending on what kind of business you're in. But I want to talk about a few other good reasons to set up an entity also, and then I'll get into the separation of personal and business. As John and Jared mentioned, a good reason to set up an entity is to establish your brand. If you're in business, when you set up a company, that shows that you're truly in business. So you can create a business as a sole proprietor, come up with a trade name, and you can start using that and doing any kind of business like that. That's perfectly okay. But if someone else comes along and says, hey, that's a cool name, let me create an LLC for that, they've just taken away your name. But if you've got it registered in an LLC, you've got it established that you've been using that name for a period of time. Another reason to set up an entity is that you can have multiple entities to, as John also pointed out, for different kind of businesses. From a tax strategy standpoint, what I like to do is look at the income streams and how they are taxed, meaning whether they're passive or they're active. And what that means is passive is really rental income. Active is where you have to actually work to earn the money, and it's also self-employment tax. So for SE tax, you may want to have multiple entities for different income streams. If you put them all in a single entity, the IRS gets confused and they're going to want to tax you at the highest tax rate possible. So it's best to split those out. Another cool reason for getting an entity is that you get a separate tax ID. I try my best never to give out my social security number for any reason, and having an entity is a good way to do that. If you're a landlord, you may find that you're required to issue 1099s. And if you don't have an entity with a tax ID, you're sending your social security number out to whoever's worked for you. And then that's out in the public domain. You don't know what they're going to do with it, and it's out of your control. But if you have a tax ID for an entity, you can issue a 1099 or any kind of an informational return using that tax ID. The income also that gets reported to you gets reported on that tax ID, and that goes into an entity. It doesn't show up on your tax return necessarily. It may flow through to you, but the IRS isn't looking at you to see that number show up on your return specifically, because it's going to a business. Another cool reason to set up an entity and to set it up earlier rather than later is that you establish a start date for your business. And for seasoning, you guys that deal with banks understand seasoning, that you've got to hold property for a period of time before they can issue a new loan on it. That comes up a lot. Well, when you go to borrow money, banks like to see how long you've been in business. And if you set up an LLC, this year, and you're, 3 years past, and whether or not you've had any activity in that LLC or not, it's just, you've just hung on to it. You still can say that, yeah, I set that up 3 years ago. So it looks like you've been in business for 3 years, which technically you've been in business. You just haven't generated a lot of activity in that business, which comes to another reason is to create what I call a pocket LLC. What this is you set up an LLC, get a tax ID for it. And it's there for an opportunity that comes up. Now, nowadays, it doesn't take very long to set up an LLC. You can log on the Secretary of State's website, set that up, call John or Jared, and they could set that up for you in a day, get a tax ID. It's pretty quick. But, in the past, I found myself in a situation where I was working on a contract and I realized, oops, I need another entity for this. And I just went ahead and created one on the spot. put it in the contract, and set it up that next day. In fact, actually, this was before the Secretary of State was set up really well on the computers. I drove to Baton Rouge and set it up myself. But now I have extra ones set aside in case an opportunity comes up and I want to use that. So that's whether you want to enter in a joint venture with someone and have that income stream go into a specific entity, so you don't commingle that with other entities that you have. So that's part of the layering aspect that John was talking about, and just having different entities. So entities are important for those reasons. I know I read a lot of blogs on or articles or questions on bigger pockets, for instance, and they're always asking, when do you set up an entity? And it comes back to, you set up an entity when you're starting a business. And if you're getting in the rental business or you're becoming a real estate investor, you should probably have an entity just so you can start marketing yourself and building your brand. And like Jared said, people start taking you more seriously because you have that. Now, a key thing is with an entity is the whole purpose of the entity is to set up liability protection for yourself, at least one layer. It's not the whole thing, but it makes it hard for a claimant in a lawsuit to get to your personal assets to get through that. But if you're not separating your business and your personal activities, and you're treating your business as a piggy bank, as Jared said, you're not going to have that protection, because they're going to look at it and say, well, you're not treating this any different than you, so we should be able to go after everything that you have. So the first thing you need to do is, if you have an LLC, is to set up a banking account, and then make sure that any revenues you get go in that bank account. Any expenses for the business go in that bank account. So if you set up an LLC for your rental property, you want to make sure all your rents go into the LLC account, and you want to pay the mortgage out of that. You want to pay all the expenses for maintenance and taxes and insurance. And then what's left over, you can pull out anytime you want. And that's just considered a distribution to you. You're going to be taxed on that money anyway, so it's basically yours to pull out as you want. And and as you grow bigger, you have even more things to consider. So you want to make sure that you pay the $30 every year to the Secretary of State, because if you are not in good standing with the Secretary of State, from what I've understood, and I've read several situations where the IRS have gone after people and gone directly through the company to the individual, because it turned out you can't be represented in court because you have no standing in court. Now, it's an easy fix to get that caught up, but you want to make sure that you keep that caught up. You want to make sure you have a registered agent, and you want to make sure that if you're doing business in a different state, that you are set up to do business in that state, that you registered your LLC. And depending on what you're planning on doing in a state, you might want to set up a separate LLC in that state. For instance, we're really close to Mississippi over here. A lot of people are doing business in Mississippi and Louisiana. So if that's happening and you're generating a lot of revenues in Mississippi and in Louisiana, you're paying tax in both states. And if you try to avoid that and you don't pay tax in, say, Mississippi, and you're doing business over there, something's going to happen. And especially if you get in a legal situation where you're drawn in a lawsuit, you can't defend yourself in court, and you get a judgment against you, and then judgments can cross state lines because they can file with the court to have it attached to whatever you got. So you've got to be careful that you maintain the sanctity of that LLC and that separate business. And, you know, one issue, of course, with layering, as John mentioned, which would be, say, setting up an LLC for every property that you own, maybe with a holding company that owns those to minimize the number of tax returns you have. As you've got a lot of accounting you've got to do. So you've got to set up simple systems that you can do that. And some programs like Stessa is a really good one It's free. It manages stuff for your properties. QuickBooks is a little more robust, and that's something that you can use, especially if you have multiple businesses and different types of stuff. So there's a learning curve with any kind of software, but it could be something that you could use. So those are some things to think about when you're trying to keep your business separated. A key thing not to do is pay any of your personal expenses out of the business. Now, it turns out I see this all the time, and I have this conversation a lot with a lot of clients. They'll go to the store, they'll buy groceries out of their company. They'll use whatever credit card is handy or whatever debit card they have that has money in it. And I understand that. The thing to do when that happens, if you found that you've used your card inadvertently or on purpose, but because that's where the funds were, but you can fix that later by reimbursing the company and transferring money back in, and just document that. And that shows that you're keeping them separate. Because if you're walking around if you have 7 LLCs and you have 7 debit cards in your pocket, you're going to pull out the wrong one occasionally and use it inadvertently and not notice till you get back and you're entering the stuff in your accounting system and realizing that, or you're looking at your account on the online at the bank and you're realizing that you used the wrong card. In which case you fix that by just transferring funds between, it's either you back into the company or between the LLC that should have spent that, or whatever the case may be. So those are some simple things to think about when you're trying to keep your personal and your business stuff separated. And as far as, basic taxes are concerned with LLCs, there's really no tax effect of having an LLC. It's the same thing as if you're a sole proprietor and or a single member LLC and you're sole proprietor, you're not going to be taxed any differently. So from a tax standpoint, there's only a benefit when you get to the point where you have an active business. So if you're a wholesaler or if you're a flipper or rehabber, that's considered active income, and you're going to be taxed on self-employment tax with that. Once your income gets above a certain level that's considered reasonable compensation, you're better off electing to be taxed as an S corp. You still have an LLC. Legally, it's an LLC, but for tax purposes, the IRS is going to treat you like an S corp. What that means is you have to set up a payroll, pay yourself a reasonable salary, and any money that you earn over that is considered profits, and you can distribute those funds to you without paying SE tax on it. So that's an advanced strategy, but I do that with most of my clients that grow their rehab operations fairly large, and other small businesses that are just an active business. That would be a law firm, for instance, a restaurant, doctor's offices, that kind of stuff. You basically want to look at that strategy when you get to the point where you're making more than what's considered reasonable compensation. And the question of what is reasonable compensation is a big question. The IRS thinks it's a really big number. You want to come up with a way that you can justify it being as low as possible. The only rules out there is that it can't be zero. However, if your S corp LLC taxes an S corp actually has a loss for the year, I don't think it's reasonable that you pay yourself a salary and create taxes when none were due. So, but if you have profits, you have to basically pay yourself a salary somewhere in there. And that's more of a tax strategy that I would sit down with a client and we'd come up with what that number would be. And then we set a plan in place and work towards that plan. And without, I'll be happy to answer any questions. That's basically the reasons to set up an entity and some of the basic tax stuff with LLCs and S corps. I don't know if anyone has any specific questions.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and what we'll do is I'll go ahead and start. I have some questions that I know people ask a lot that I'm going to put out to Bob, Jared, and John. But Herman had one. So if you guys see the chat down on the bottom, that's where you can ask questions. Herman said, if I have a rental property or another asset already, can I add it to an LLC after the fact? Like, for example,
the answer is yes, but I'll let John talk about the best way to do that. Since that's a legal question.
Yeah, that's pretty simple. I mean, you definitely can do that after the fact. Sometimes we have clients often that'll, own property in one LLC, and then they kind of restructure their setup and they want to transfer certain assets in certain LLCs. There's no real title work that has to be done. If you wanted us to do a quick title scan, we could, but if we handle the first transaction, we would just draft a legal document transferring interest from your one LLC to the other, and that has to be recorded at the courthouse. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, or personally to an LLC. Doesn't have to technically be an LLC to another LLC.
Yeah. One thing I want to say to that, kind of piggybacking off of that, is that some people think that they want to take all of their investment properties and put them into one LLC. And this may be being a dead horse. We might have already talked about this a little bit, but if you put all of your assets into one LLC, the person, if something happens, somebody, you're going to look at one of your properties that it's a flip, and you've got 15 other properties you're working on at flips at the same time. Somebody walks in and steps on a nail and puts a nail on their foot. That person is going to sue the property owner. That property owner is going to be sued for whatever assets they own. If that property owner is an LLC that owns 10 other properties, all of those properties are going to be subject to a claim from somebody who stepped on a nail and got hurt, or tripped over something and broke their neck. What, John, you laughing at my example?
It would have to be a pretty big nail, to go after the team. But yeah.
No pain and suffering. It's the pain and suffering, guys. You know it.
Yes.
So look, and you guys are hearing these situations that they're explaining about liability. Oftentimes I share with sellers the whole, oh, hey. I share with them about liability. So many people, it's an invisible reality in our life. And so many people don't understand the liability they face. I have literally had people, sellers or whoever, where I talk to them about the liability they have with owning a property, say a vacant property or what have you. And I say, hey, look, if someone trips, breaks their neck, who are they going to sue? They're going to go look and sue you, right? No, it is one of those things where so many people are like, oh, well, people ain't going to sue me. I had someone who had some family members living in, they were kind of squatting. They were kind of landlords. Jared, you remember this one? They cursed us both out. The 3% owner.
Yeah.
And she's like, my family's not going to sue me. I was like, ma'am, there are entire TV shows on this called Judge Judy and Judge Joe Brown. Like, seriously, there's entire shows on this stuff. People do sue for stupid crap all the time. So we don't say it to scare you, but just in the day and age, back when I started in property management back in 2014, I had to learn how to get some thick skin because people frequently threaten to sue. And now it's one of those things. I mean, literally it just happened a few weeks ago. Someone threatened. They have no basis, but people put that out there often. You just need to make sure you cover yourself. So we don't say these things because, oh, it's a big bad scare. It's just the world we live in. Drive down the interstate, look what's up and down, these litigious, trying to go after predatory wise, right? So you've got to be mindful of that. So Justin just asked, how can I establish an enemy when creating an LLC? Is it through a registered agent?
I'll just go ahead and answer the question. It's very hard to do that.
Yeah.
Because on some level, there's going to be a paper trail where it's going to show who the owner is. I mean, like if you wanted to create an LLC that owned an LLC that owned an LLC, somebody would have to go through the paper trail of going to look at the name of the owner of one LLC and the name of the next LLC and the owner of that LLC, which happens to be an individual.
Yeah.
The question then comes, why do we want to be anonymous? What is the goal in that? And can you achieve that through something else? For example, we made my trust for one of the properties, one of my complex deals. I put it in a trust because I bought a property that had 1.4 million in liens against it, and I bought it subject to those liens. And so when I bought that property, one of my entities bought it, and then we put it into a trust. You know, the previous owner that I got it from told me he would get 15 calls a year. I am dang proud of some people, and I'm all but about to hire them because I've had 2 people find me and reach out to me on Facebook for that property. And that's not easy because it's owned by a pretty anonymous trust. And
Yeah.
so, you know, hey, they did some digging. And so honestly, like literally, I might go to those people and offer them a job because they somehow found me.
For strictly for holding, maybe it's going to be more difficult to find out depending on how much you layer it. But if it's the business that you're running revenue through, if the asset that it holds actually generates revenue, you need to have a bank account for that, right? That bank account is going to be tied to a tax ID, and the tax ID is going to be acquired through the submission of personal information to the IRS. So if it's strictly for holding, yeah, you get creative like Courtney, because when you put it in trust, you don't have to file the entire trust. You just have to file limited information as an extract of trust whenever you're transferring it. So, but if someone has the energy, they'll hunt. They can follow the trail pretty.
You know, that could be another good reason why you set up an operating agreement and you have people in place. That by doing that, you may be able to establish some sort of a business that is owned by an individual who transfers an interest to somebody else, and for a time period between filing it in the annual report, that information is not going to be public record until a year later whenever you submit your annual report. Then you're going to have to then update the record showing all the record owners, and so that entity at that point you'll be listed. But for a short period of time, if you know you and a partner start a business, the partner starts the business, transfers interest to you immediately after it started. According to the Secretary of State, there was one member starting the business, and at the annual report, it's updated.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the annual report functions in and of itself to show the world its function is to maintain entities, keep them as a legitimate business practice, and then also to notify other people about who to contact and who's involved in the case that somebody is sued or somebody wants to purchase property that's blighted in certain situations. It's there for that purpose, so it's hard to get around it. They've set it up in a way so that it's hard to circumvent that.
If you haven't looked up a business before, Google Louisiana Secretary of State business search. And I don't care, go look up my name. You know, go look up someone you know who owns a business. You can look up by the business name. You can look up by, you know, someone's name. And you can see some information. If you have an LLC and you haven't looked it up there, go look it up on there. You can learn a lot. Chris has a question. She says, what have you seen work to get lenders to lend directly into an LLC that doesn't have a portfolio to show? Any particular type of lenders, thing to provide, do in advance, etc.?
First, I would say some might be more amenable to offering, you know, a loan if there's a personal guarantee involved. Obviously, generally you're going to see that anyway when there's a loan involved with the LLC. Jared, particular lenders, you know, again, might be just more willing to do it than others. I don't know because we don't do the actual underwriting, right, on obviously any loans that come through us, what their criteria are as far as history of P&Ls. But one of the ways that you can, again, you can acquire it personally, right? And there are ways to then transfer it efficiently and effectively and ensure, you know, payment is maintained on the loan, such to avoid any due on sale clause as best as possible, right? Because people do it, let's be honest, frequently. People purchase property in their name, they get the loan in their name, and they transfer it into an LLC. So it's not something that doesn't happen. Jared or Bob, I don't know.
The banks aren't opposed to lending to LLCs. In fact, a lot of commercial banks prefer it to be in a company name, but they're going to want you to personally guarantee it. And depending on how much money you're going to put down on the project, you know, if you put 50% down on a project, the banks aren't going to care if you set it up yesterday or 3 years ago. They're going to still make you personally guarantee it, but they have more assurance. But if you're trying to get in without no money down, they're not even going to touch it. So, you know, and the low down payment loans that are backed by the federal government, you can't get those in LLCs. Those are personal loans. So those are where you would buy those, and then you would transfer after a period of time that you've met the criteria, you would transfer those into an LLC. As long as you're making the payments on the loans, the banks don't really care at that point. And as long as you continue to make the payments, they don't care. But you're still going to be, because the loan doesn't get transferred, just the property does. You're still on the hook for the loan no matter what. So if you default on the loan, they're coming after you, and the LLC isn't going to protect you from the bank. So just keep that in mind. It's like, you know, you're going to have a personal guarantee. They're coming after the guy with the biggest pockets, and the LLC isn't going to protect you from that.
I'll say that if you're looking for like names of particular banks that around St. Tammany that are lending to people who are buying real estate, the Resource Bank's always like the #1 in commercial lending. But you know, smaller banks or newer banks in the area like Red River Bank, those types of people are trying to get established in the community, and so they may be willing to do some investments with you if you can show some income statements and bank statements. They may be willing to do that. Heritage Bank, I know they have a board that they present a lot of their transactions to, and I know that they will individually consider different situations depending on, you know, the property value, the rental income. Angel Oak also is more of a little bit bigger bank that has some products for investors too. Right. So you know, one of the things John and I benefits of working with a bigger regional title company, and Fleur has offices from Baton Rouge to Hammond, Covington, Slidell, 3 in New Orleans, 1 in Metairie. The fact that we have a reach like that, we can connect you with a lot of lenders and banks that may be willing to, you know, if one person tells you no, well, try this guy. And so we have a lot of relationships that we can leverage and help you guys out if you'll have any questions for different people. You know, you use John and I as a resource, not only for legal advice, but if you have a question about, you know, relationships for people in the real estate community, we can tend to connect you with the right people. You know, I connect a lot of people with Courtney. I connect a lot of people with certain lenders that do certain things, real estate agents that provide certain services, CPAs like Mr. Bob. Like we're far reaching. When John and I closed 85 transactions in the month of April, which was a great month. And if we, just based on that, it was 87 different transactions that we were a part of. A lot of lenders, a lot of real estate agents, a lot of people in the community, real estate investors. You know, sometimes people like to partner up on certain deals. We can definitely be a resource to connect you with those people.
Sure thing. One of the things that I did when I was first starting out years ago was I very purposefully opened up bank accounts at certain places. First of all, so you've got national banks like the Chase, Capital One, Wells Fargo. These are one you can travel pretty much anywhere in the U.S. and you can find an ATM. So I've always kind of kept my personal stuff with them just because when I travel abroad, it's just a lot easier. And their technology is pretty high and all that. But for business, I tend to stay community and like regional and local banks because they tend to be a lot more, well, I don't know if you guys have been watching with all the PPP loan and all the SBA stuff. The big banks are getting torn up with bad reviews for how they dealt with small businesses. And it's really been the small banks, the local and the regional ones that have really come in and saved the day with a lot of business owners because they were just, I know my mother works for one, and I mean, they literally were paying their employees lunches, like so that they, one, wouldn't be exposed, you know, with COVID-19 going on, but also so that they were continuing just pumping through these loans. And so what I did is I did very strategic banking relationships with, when I would open up a new entity, I would have them at a new bank because I wanted to like learn these banks and create some relationships. Now, over the years, I've kind of restructured some things, but that has been really helpful for me to create relationships as I've started to, over the years, establish myself. Let's see. Angie said, my dad and I are in an LLC 50-50. I've been taking draws of $1,500 a month to supplement income. I was told that he's allowed to gift me $15,000 a year. How does that affect us individually on taxes? Bob, you want to do that?
So
I think that's a loaded question there, right, Mr. Bob?
right.
Yeah.
So as an owner of an LLC, you can draw out capital at any time that you want. So the fact that you're pulling out $1,500 a month and your dad's not pulling out any money doesn't matter. That just means you're depleting your capital account. Now, if he's having to put money in to add capital to it so you can pull capital out, that's also, it's up to your operating agreement on how that works. That's still not considered really income to you. It's just you're upside down. You're basically borrowing money from your dad in that case. If he gives you money directly outside of the LLC, that's where the gifting comes in, because it doesn't run through an LLC. An LLC doesn't gift you money. You're either getting income from the LLC or you're drawing out capital or contributing capital to it. Now, what does happen a lot with LLCs, if you have an active member and you have an investor member, sometimes the active member draws out what's called guaranteed payments, where it's considered a salary, but you're not getting a salary per se. It gets reported as a guaranteed payment, and it's agreed in the operating agreement that you're going to be paid so much a year or a month, and then you're going to actually pay self-employment tax on that. And the partner will get a deduction from that, from his portion of the income for the LLC. So it just depends on how you have the thing set up. But the way you invest, I'm sorry, Jerry?
So also, when speak to the, I've dealt with this personally, that is also going to show up as a loss for your LLC. And over a certain amount of years, if that entity is not actually generating any income, and your dad's and somebody's injecting capital in there, and you're taking draws out of that also can kind of get on the line of piercing the corporate veil, because you're not, after a certain amount of years of a loss based on withdrawals that are beyond what's reasonable for the work that's being done, that'll be considered a hobby. Is that correct?
Yeah, it could be considered a hobby. There's if you have any business that has losses 3 out of 5 years, the IRS might come in and consider that a hobby. And there's a lot of things that go into that. So that's more complex in this conversation. But if you've got a business plan and you're working to grow the business, Amazon, I don't think they've ever made a profit. So they're definitely not a hobby. But, so it doesn't always apply. But if you're a small business, it could. Now, piercing the corporate veil, one of the issues that comes into that, which none of us have really talked about, and Jared sort of alluded to it, is if you don't have the proper capital for your business, that could be one of the reasons saying, look, the owners have depleted all the capital out of this. So obviously we have to go to the owners to get a judgment for them, or get, compensation for whatever the lawsuit might be. So you have to be careful with pulling out too much capital, but for a short period of time, that's not that big of a deal.
So she had a follow-up question. She said, it is my understanding that I cannot withdraw money from the LLC for any other reasons than to invest in real estate. Is this true? Last year was a total loss, but this year will be different. Is there a certain amount of income from wholesaling that I should be wary of in one LLC?
So you can form an LLC for any lawful purpose, right, in Louisiana. So if your operating agreement restricts you, or your articles of organization restrict you to investment of real estate as the sole business purpose, then you may have a restriction on being able to pull out money strictly for the business's purpose of the business. But notwithstanding or barring a restriction operating agreement wise or from your articles of organization to that effect, as long as it's not unlawful, I don't know, and you follow up, Bob or Jared, I don't think there's any reason that you should be entirely restricted from pulling out money in regard or for purposes other than investing in real estate. Oh, the above was for tax purposes.
Well, there's a couple. So you're going to be taxed on the income for the LLC. Let's say the LLC has $10,000 in its account. You do one transaction, you make $10,000, but then you have $10,000 expenses. So you're still left with $10,000 of capital in the account but you had no taxable income, you can draw that $1,500 out and you're not going to be taxed on it because that's capital you have in the company. As an owner of the LLC, you can, as long as your operating agreement, if you're a single member owner of LLC, you can pull money out for any reason you want to. There's no one stopping you from doing it because you get to vote. You have 100% of the vote. You do whatever you want. You can pull every penny out of it if you want. You just have to realize you're going to have to put money back in when the LLC starts generating expenses, or you're going to need to do something. Your LLC, if you have an LLC that's set up for a purpose, a specific purpose, and you invest in something that's outside of its purpose, even though it's a legal purpose, that could be a reason that they could pierce the corporate veil if you get sued, saying, hey, you're doing something that goes against the articles of organization, goes against your operating agreement, and therefore we want to go to you. We want to go against your assets or the assets of the other LLC or whatever the reason is. But you know, the issue is if you're a wholesaler and you decide that you want to buy and hold a property, and you do that in the same LLC that you're wholesaling, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But the IRS is going to say you're a dealer because you're a wholesaler, and real estate is inventory for you, so you don't get to depreciate it. You don't get capital gains, and you can't do 1031 exchanges. So one of the reasons why you set up a separate LLC to hold real estate is so you can say this LLC over here is in the business of holding real estate. This LLC over here is in the business of wholesaling, and they're two separate businesses, even though you're running both of them and you own 100% of them. That's the big purpose of having multiple LLCs and making sure that that's what I call streams of income. You want to see what they are and what their tax effects are, and make sure you separate those so the IRS doesn't end up taxing you at the highest possible tax rate when you can avoid that.
Angie had a great question as far as, is there a certain amount of income, you know, say from wholesaling or something else that I should be wary of in one LLC? Look, one of the things is you're going to grow. So some things that may apply to you today, your business may have to change as you grow. Like, for example, hey, right now I'm doing all the appointments or I'm doing whatever, you know, it may not necessarily be where you may be starting off and you have no employees. You could grow your business and then you have employees. So there's gonna be ways your business is gonna grow whenever you grow. So like I said, I started off in one entity, and then over time, as I grew to my company doing, you know, numbers of deals a year and different things and doing different ventures, I then grew. I found this right before we went here. This is an old spreadsheet, like drawing I made of whenever I started, I don't know, Bob, what, now a year and a half ago, whatever, I changed my company, something like that. I basically restructured all of my companies because it was, you know, I was just doing so many different things in different ways. And so literally it looks like a big old web, right? But you can see that I had the different companies under, you know, the parent companies. There is a level that having a good CPA or a good attorney on your team that can help. This should not be what someone does when buying all these different LLCs and doing all these strategic things, because entities and asset protection, that's all good and great. But some of my business mentors and my investing mentors in real estate now, real estate over the years, in the beginning, I was getting so caught up in the entities and all these things and these strategies. And two of them just straight up told me, he said, Courtney, you don't have anything that you need like to protect. So there is a level that you want to do things properly and you want to protect, but you don't, if you're not consistently doing deals, you don't need something like this. But just know that someday as you grow, you can then expand what you need, if that makes sense. So Bob, and do you guys want to answer the question about, you know, basically when your company's starting to make a certain amount of money, should you be wary one company making so much money?
Well, the issue there, if you're in wholesaling, which is an active business, meaning you're going to pay self-employment taxes on top of income taxes. Once you get to a certain level, and I don't have a number, but that would be considered reasonable compensation, a salary for what someone that's a wholesaler should be making. Once your company makes, now this is net income, so it's, you know, assignment fees minus all your marketing expenses and any other expenses you can throw in there. If it makes more than that, then you're going to want to elect to be taxed as an S corp so that you can fix your salary at that reasonable level, and any money you do make over that will only be taxed as income tax and not also as self-employment tax. And I'm not sure what that number is. You can't Google wholesaler to find out what a salary for a wholesaler is. But if you look at the closest analogy to that, which might be a real estate agent in this area, a real estate agent makes between reasonable salaries between 30 and 40,000 a year. So if your net income as a wholesaler is above 40,000 a year, I would say that that's probably a good point where you want to switch over to becoming taxed as an S corp in your LLC. As far as, you know, a number you should be wary of in one LLC, that's not any concern because you can pull all the money out. It's just that, you know, now as far as building up and storing the money in the LLC, you don't want to do that. You want to keep a reasonable amount of capital in the LLC, but the rest of the money you want to pull out and invest in something else. Either buy real estate in another LLC. I don't like investing in the stock market, but that's a good place to put a little bit of funds. Start socking away money in a Roth IRA so you can build it up and become a private lender to other wholesalers and rehabbers in your self-directed IRA in Quest. You know, some of those things are what you would do if you're generating a bunch of cash. When you get to the point where you're generating that cash, you're coming up with, because you don't have a limitation of cash anymore, you're finding more and more opportunities to do bigger and bigger deals. Right. So, you know, you're going to be setting up more LLCs and more entities that you're going to be doing. So I'd worry about trying to make as much money as possible first, then worry about how to break down the LLCs.
And that's all fair. One of the biggest things is, like, for example, having to, I mean, the self-employment tax, those things are huge. Until you start paying them, until you start paying them, you don't really know how much of a headache they are. So one of the things we did is we moved my company after to an S corp, being taxed as an S corp. This is my main company. So when he talks about wholesaling, that's also the active income. That could be you could be a flipper, you could be a realtor. Those three things are generally similar as far as active and earned income. And look, I mean, I've done a handful of flips this year, made $20,000, $30,000 on these flips, where, you know, those numbers can add up over time, where those numbers can come high. It's switching over to that S corp has helped give me a W-2. I have not been very lendable to banks because you're fighting that game of, do I strategize with my taxes and like show a very low income because I'm writing everything off? Or do I give myself a reasonable salary, like income, so I can go get a loan? That is a thing that is very important, because that becomes a business decision of what's more important to you, lowering your taxes and, you know, doing all these things, or being able to be lendable with, say, a W-2 or whatever you can show as far as with your taxes. So those things are the strategies. You've got to figure them out based on your own goals. A lot of times too, it's really good to strategize these things. And don't get me wrong, I like it. But as Bob mentioned, the very best thing you can do is go out and earn the money, and it be a problem you have to address, because it's introducing, you know, more problems. I want my big goals to be producing bigger problems in my life, and not just dreaming about them, right? So you know, working hard to do those things. Let's see, B&H said, if I have each property in its own LLC, do I still need a holding/parent company? John and them, you guys want to?
Well, I mentioned earlier, it could help with fluidity of revenue stream and might make it easier as far as tax returns. That's a Bob question there. Legally speaking, it could create another level of protection, right? It's if you're getting, again, presuming that it's all operating and running like legitimate business, right? The more layers you have, theoretically, right, the more insulation from liability you're going to have. Other than that,
Hey, John, real quick question for you to piggyback on this. We just recently made an operating agreement for a new company I made that's a partnership, and it's owned, this new entity is owned by another entity that I have, one of the parent companies. And one of those things, that is just a strategy. It's not necessary, it's just a strategy. But for example, if I have an LLC that's owned by another company, and someone sue, who, like, say they sue this new company that I have, can you talk a little bit about that? I'm kind of playing stupid here, just to ask a question because others may be asking it.
So that's funny you bring it up. I was just reading this article about a Supreme Court case out of Florida that had an issue where they allowed a creditor to seize a single member's assets in the LLC, and if that asset is in fact ownership of another LLC, it brings a question of, can they get to it? Now that's Florida, that's not Louisiana. It's purely speculative to say whether or not that would be a viable avenue for a claim here. If, again, everything's being run as a proper LLC, the idea is that only the assets that are held by the entity against which a valid claim, and I say valid, I guess that against which it can be construed to be made against, is going to be subject, I think, to that claim itself, right? So if you have the LLC, it owns property, and then you've got your umbrella, right? You're creating an insulation where that they can't just say, hey, look, we're putting both LLCs into the mix as far as naming defendants. They can name you as a defendant, but I think you'd have a pretty strong argument of accepting them out of the litigation as an improper party. Is that answer?
John reads Supreme Court cases like for fun when he's laying in his bed trying to fall asleep.
It's good to put you to sleep.
Bob, anything you wanted to say to those points about owning? B&H's question was, if I have each property in its own LLC, do I still need a holding / parent company?
So you don't necessarily. It doesn't affect you from a tax standpoint. It might affect you from a management efficiency standpoint. Now, one of the things that I like to do, and I have seen this, especially with some of my larger clients that have a lot of investments, and they're dealing with banks a lot. And so this comes from that experience, is that when you own LLCs, if you're a single member owner, they're disregarded, and you have a bunch of rental properties on your Schedule E on your tax return where the rental properties is shown, you have a listing for all the properties. And the more properties you have, the more confusing it gets for the bankers when they look at it and they're trying to analyze where your income is and what kind of a risk you have. But there's a second page to Schedule E, which is where all the LLCs are listed. And they're listed in a little thing, and they look like they're investments, and you're an investor. It's like you're getting dividends from stock. So they do want to know where those are and more about those companies, but they're not as confused by that as they are about seeing so many rental properties. So what that means is that it's a good idea to set up an LLC that's a holding company, that's a partnership, either you and your spouse, or you and another entity that maybe an S corp or something, owns a small percentage, so it requires it to file a tax return because it's now a partnership. And then that holding company owns all the LLCs that own all the properties. And so that holding company then files a tax return and shows all the rental properties. But on your tax return, you just show one line that shows your net income from all the rental properties. And it looks like you're an investor. And your tax return is easier for the bankers to analyze. So that would be a reason to do it. That doesn't really have anything to do with taxes and doesn't have anything to do from a legal strategy. It's more of just a business organizational strategy. The other benefit too is as a single member LLC, it's disregarded, meaning you don't have a tax return. So if you have one LLC that owns a bunch of other LLCs and it's a single member, those sub LLCs do not have to file tax returns. So you can minimize the number of tax returns that you have to file. The amount of work to actually produce that tax return still may be the same. You're just not having to file a separate tax return, having to track all those down every single time that you need to go.
That's been very helpful for me. That's been something that's been very helpful. This year I've gone over to switched over to some bookkeeping, gotten better in the bookkeeping for the different companies. Look, I had 7 debit cards in my wallet at one point. It just was blowing up. Whenever I grew to a certain point, it made sense for me to have those 2 parent companies, basically an active company and a holding company, depending on the type of businesses I was running. And I literally have a credit card for each company, and it's easy for me to then, I got rid of all those debit cards because now I run things through credit. It just makes it easier from an administration standpoint, paperwork wise, things like that. It has been easier. But again, those things are not necessarily necessary until you reach a certain point, but all things to think about. And that's why it's good to have someone who on your team understands. I think I felt like I was trying to educate my CPA for years, especially like when I do complex stuff. They just don't really know where to file it or what to do. They didn't understand wholesaling a whole lot. So those things are, important. Even for bookkeeping part, like how do you run the books on a flip that you buy in November and you sell in March, and you're crossing over the year. Those things are important. I wrote down a few questions of things I get asked all the time. What are your guys' idea of using leverage? Like, for example, if someone has a loan on a property, so using leverage as a way to offset, basically helping with asset protection. Some people say, hey, look, I've got these properties in an LLC, but they all are they've got loans to the hilt. And so if someone were to sue, I don't have a lot of equity. What are your thoughts on that? I've had some people just say, oh, well, I own all these properties, but I keep mortgages on them. So no one can really tap into anything because they don't,
I mean, I think that's, again, I guess you're going to want to have insurance because someone mentioned earlier deep pockets. I think it was Bob going after the deep pockets, right? So the idea is that you're always going to list the deepest pockets or go after the deepest pockets if there's a creditor claim to satisfy any type of claim you might have. I could understand where that would be off-putting to a creditor, right? To see, there's not enough equity. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. It's the same really theory as to why in bankruptcy courts, right, some of the property might be disclaimed because there's not enough equity in there to help out a part of the plan or to really be involved. So I can foresee that. Similarly, in that kind of vein, minimal or minority interests owning an LLC, right? There's less fair market value to that. So if you're thinking about leveraging what might otherwise be perceived as a disadvantage or a negative in your LLCs, right? Those are things you can kind of work with as far as making you seem less appealable to creditors.
Well, look, there's been times that look, an attorney's not going to take a case if they don't see a chance of getting paid, right?
Right.
And so a lot of times there's just some general things Like for example, sometimes just having the entity in place in the first place kind of helps put up a wall of a barrier to where whether someone wants, you know, an attorney feels like doing the work to do all the work to do the lawsuit. So one of those things with, want to ask a question, should people be using things like LegalZoom and doing their own, creating their own, you know, using LegalZoom to do contracts and to create operating agreements, or to do things like just make your own on your own LLC on the Secretary of State? Some people have come to me and asked me, hey, do I really, like, can I just go use an online platform like that? Do I really need to consider using an attorney, you know, hiring one? I've had that question.
Look,
Basically, when it comes to an entity and asset protection, how valid is using stuff like that?
I'm always aware of that, not just because, you know, obviously Jared and I, we're attorneys, make our living off of this. Bob makes his living off being a CPA, so he makes his living off his knowledge. But I have so many times had to deal and work for clients in miserable situations because they've done just that. And look, it might not be every single time that you know, the risk might be different depending on the dynamics of what contract it is and what exactly is trying to be accomplished. But, you know, just because I can brush my teeth every morning, every night, doesn't mean I'm not going to go to the dentist if I need, you know, a root canal or something like that. I mean, like, yes, I trust myself to be sensible, right? But if it's a serious endeavor that I want to reap serious benefits or take seriously at all, I'm going to want to go to the expert about it. Right. You know, LegalZoom, I've personally never gotten on there. I've never used it. I know a lot of their, from what I've heard anyway, are disclaimers as to it not being as effective in Louisiana, just given the nature of our civil code as opposed to common law in the other states. So, you know, there are always validity concerns as far as the nature of the contract and the scope and the substance of the contract. So, you know, we've made it our business to be competitive with people like that because that's, you know, they are a market disruptor, and one of the things business have to do to survive is to keep pace. So, you know, Bob said earlier, it's all about putting simple systems in place to help you thrive, and that's what LegalZoom kind of is as a business model, right? So it's up to us to do that with our expertise as it relates to this nuanced subject matter, and to heighten the client's experience better than what they would have gotten from a computer.
You
Well, I
mentioned
want to say I've looked at.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Bob.
I've seen a lot of operating agreements, and I've seen a lot of the checkbox operating agreements and things like that. And the problem is, they don't really cover all the essential things you need to have an operating agreement. Now, if it's just a single member operating agreement, it doesn't really matter. Other, you know, like John was mentioning, is like they usually don't cover what happens if the single member dies and what happens if they're disabled and all that. That's something that no one would think about in that, and especially on LegalZoom, because that's the will that they want to sell you. But the problem is when you have two people involved, you have to think about all the issues, and the reason you want to sit down with an attorney and go through it is because they have experienced or know about or seen all these situations that you would never have thought even could arise because of their experience and all the reading that they do and their expertise. And they want to add those provisions in there to make sure that you're covered. And also, when you're first starting an LLC, usually all the partners are in agreement with everything. Any negative stuff's down the road falling. Oh, we'll take care of that. Well, let's just decide today and agree what we're going to do. It's like, okay, because we're all in agreement. The worst time to try to figure out something is when you didn't put it in your operating agreement. Now you're fighting over it later on. There's no way to get out of that cheaply.
I'll tell you a nightmare I saw recently. Somebody presented me a power of attorney that they got off LegalZoom. And the way the document read is it said that I, person, give my authority to so-and-so to handle the following actions. And the next thing it said was, the following action, like initial all the following actions that are applicable. And it listed from A to Z all these things that were applicable with a little line next to it. At the very bottom, it had a signature blank with a notary stamp, which some guy notarized this document and 2 witnesses. And I got it presented to me. He's like, here's my power of attorney. I looked at it and I read it. And I'm like, so it says that everything with an initial next to it is the rights that the representative has on behalf of that person. Not one of those things had been initialed. Because they got the document off the internet and they walked over to a notary and signed it in front of them and didn't initial anything. So that power of attorney effectively gave that person 0 authority to act on their behalf. And that person was now incapable of signing any other documents. They were an older person who had some disabilities, and that document was no longer effective. And it did, because that person went to LegalZoom, paid probably more than they would have paid us to do it, and then brought it to us without any effect. So that's our job is to make sure it's done right. We have an E&O policy when things aren't done correctly, and our job and our expertise and our experience allows us to make sure those things are done the right way. So when you actually have to use them, they actually work.
So one of the points here I'm making is, yes, I use these guys, and because a lot of you guys ask who I use, but it's more so the point is, so many people, I read it all day long on Facebook and Bigger Pockets, different things, and I hear it too, is people here wanting to skip corners on some of these things that are really the important things. Like when it comes to some of these things with an entity, you skip corners. For example, with that power of attorney, people, they cut corners and it came around and bit them in the butt, right? So there's some things that you can hustle and find a good thing, but then there's always things that you need to say. And I want to end this conversation in a bit. We still have some time. We have about 10 minutes. But a big point I have here, guys, is you want to decide, am I in this to make a quick buck, or am I in this for the long haul and I'm going to treat it like a business? Because if you're in it for a quick buck, you're going to fizzle out, and you're probably already checked off the webinar anyway. Because there's a good turnover of people in this business who are like, oh, I'm going to make it rich. I'm going to be the next millionaire. And then 2 weeks later, they're, selling, like they have an Amazon store, they're Forex trading or something. They're on to the next thing. But if you go ahead and you're like, you know what, I want to leave, I want to leave a portfolio of rentals to my kids, or I want to build legacy wealth for my family, or, I want to build a business that is respectable, whatever it looks like. When you're thinking 30 years down the road, that's when these things truly matter. How you set up your business, because if you're doing business in in the community for years, in this day and age, these are the things that you need to put some time and effort and really say, yeah, I'm going to invest money into my business to set up. In the beginning, I was flipping and turning and creating LLCs, doing things, and I never really set up operating agreements. I never really set things properly in place. And now I'm busier than ever, and I know the importance of it. I'm having to do it retroactively. So those things that are important to really pay attention to, because, hey, maybe you've grown your business some, and you need to go back and look at how you started things and make sure you did it properly. So these things are important. And the reason why I asked that is I wanted to ask, hey, are there real life scenarios where you've seen people cut corners? And Jared gave a perfect example one. And I hope that kind of resonates with some people. My last question, I want to bring up something is anonymity. People talk about like those Wyoming, South Dakota LLCs. I know the Wyoming one, the North is a really big one. What are you guys' thoughts on those? Is it something that, because here's my bigger question or my bigger statement is, y'all, Louisiana is not like other states in more ways than one. So you may be hearing someone talk about a podcast, or you may be doing something. I frequently go and travel to these events. But Bob, we were at that one in Atlanta, what was that, September, August last year? I had a 3-inch binder. I literally met with Jared and John when I got back from that. And I said, how can I do this creative thing? It was like, it was a huge thick binder on different ways you can do real estate deals creatively. And I came back and I literally met with Jared and John. I said, I had this part earmarked. I said, can I do this in Louisiana? I knew the speakers were from all over the US, but I wanted to know, how can I do this specifically in Louisiana? Because Louisiana is weird. What are you guys' thoughts on generally because tons of people love talking about creating up an LLC that's in a different state, that state has different laws, and you can tap into that. Can y'all real quick share on stuff along those lines?
One of the things Bob mentioned earlier is if you form an LLC out of state and for the basis of that state having more advantageous LLC laws, but you intend to do business and you do business in Louisiana, you're still going to have to register here in Louisiana. And in contrast to the LLC where your members aren't necessarily listed with the state, you'd have to be listed here. At least there would have to be some type of information for due process. Frankly, I don't know how they get around that in Wyoming. If a claim is to be made, I can guarantee you there are LLCs getting sued in Wyoming, right? And with effective and valid claims. So that's just to say, when the fining needs to be done, it is done. It would be a violation of due process otherwise. But you have to, there again, kind of get into the digging, right? I would say Louisiana LLC laws really are, the default structures are not bad. They're not negative. They can maybe use a little TLC, but that's what the operating agreements are for, right? That's how we get around what default rules might not be the most advantageous for the situation. Anyone else certainly speak to that.
So I think the reason why people use Wyoming is, and I see this with I've been to a lot of real estate seminars over the years, and everyone talks about using Nevada corporations, Wyoming stuff, because they're a tax-free state. Well, it turns out that doesn't matter if you're in Louisiana. You're paying Louisiana tax. You're paying federal tax anyway. So all they're doing is giving you this song and dance and making you spend extra money to set up your company in another state that does you no benefit in the state that you're living in. A lot of the now there are benefits in those states. If you're actually doing business in those states, then yes, you probably want to have a corporation or a LLC set up in those states. Now, one of the things with Wyoming, I think, is that because it was the first state to have LLCs, and the IRS had to come up with, and Wyoming, I think, has a rule about charging orders, that you can't actually take a member's interest in the LLC, but you can get a charging order, which means if the LLC earns money, you get if you have a judgment against that member, you get the income that the member would have. Well, the IRS came out with a rule that basically says, well, then whoever receives the income has to pay tax on it. And because an LLC doesn't have to give distributions, but the charging order would mean that the income earned by that member would flow to the judgment. The person with the judgment could end up paying taxes on income that they never received because the LLC doesn't have to distribute any distributions or any income for it. So that's an advantageous situation for someone who owns an LLC to be in if they have a judgment. And it's also sort of a poison pill from a legal standpoint, because an attorney doesn't want to sue a company and tell his clients, like, oh, by the way, you have to pay all these taxes on this money you're never going to receive, because they're not going to ever release any distributions. But with that being said, even if you set up a company in Wyoming, you're going to have to, if you buy a property in Louisiana, you're going to have to register to do business in Louisiana, because otherwise you don't have standing and you're going to lose a lawsuit. It doesn't matter where you are, wherever you get sued, that's what matters. And then as far as the tax situation, if you earn money in Louisiana, you're paying tax in Louisiana. Now, Louisiana doesn't, from a tax standpoint, Louisiana doesn't care if you're registered in the state, they're going to tax you anyway. You still have to file a tax return. Where the registration benefits you is that if you get sued, you can actually show up in court and defend yourself, because if you're not registered in the state, you can't. I think that's correct, right, John?
Pardon? If you're not registered here?
Yeah, if you're not registered here and you get sued, it's like, can you actually defend yourself? They get a summary judgment against you.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult to do. So, I mean, you might be able to appear. You probably have to get, obviously, in-state counsel. It would be a big rigmarole. Like you said earlier, they might be able to really quickly register, right, put a registered agent in. But, yeah, it's going to create more of a burden for you being out of state and not being registered within here. It's going to be more advantageous for the person going after you.
Right. And I have a client that went to one of these seminars, set up a Nevada corporation, has an operation in Florida, set up, then had to register to do business in Florida, and is doing stuff in Louisiana and registered in Louisiana, and they're paying fees out the wazoo, but they're not making any money. They're registered in 3 states. They could have just set up in the state where they're living and then focused on just that state and not set up the stuff. Because one of the things with the guys in Nevada is like, they're charging them all these fees every year just to maintain their corporation, because you're going through an attorney's, and they're charging, it's a flat rate, but it's still more than you would be doing it if you had done it on your own in your local state. So
those are just things to think about, you guys, because I do have a lot of people who I see it all the time in the forums. I see it all the time online, and they're trust but verify the stuff that you learn from seminars and books. When it comes to Louisiana, I always say you have to come and translate at home. So when you attend stuff, so it's not bad to do that. I'm gonna do my best to continue to give you local knowledge. That's why, yeah, we've got Steve from Arizona come and talk about private money, but there's gonna be a level that we're gonna have to say, hey, a lot of times I try to filter it to what I know for Louisiana. So that's why it's always good to build your team where you're working, because, hey, you wanna make sure you're not running headlong in one direction, like, maybe making corporations in other states or whatever. And then next thing you know, you're stuck with all these, bills and whatnot. Nonetheless, you guys, it's been another great webinar. Again, we've got Thursday's event. If you look in the comment section, the chat, I've got the link for that event. Next Thursday, this coming Thursday, is Steve Train with the Real Estate Disruptors podcast, going to talk on understanding private money. Look, I want to end this on a fun note. And before I do that, I just want to remind you guys what we're talking about here, guys. If your biggest takeaway is anything, is you want to build a good team around you. You want to look at what you've put in place, make sure it's good, sturdy, and get someone else's eyes on it. That doesn't hurt at all. And then secondly, think about this for a long term, not just a momentary thing where you're just in and out like fly by night. So, but before we end, Jared, John, Bob, I want to thank you guys for coming on. Can you guys end the night on giving us one just random fact about yourself?
Jared, for it.
John probably knows a lot about me that I wouldn't want him to say. I know a lot about John. We were fraternity brothers together in college, so I'll before he starts saying too much stuff about me, I'll tell everybody. I have me and my wife have a 2.5-month-old baby that I hear talking in the other room that I'm anxious to go hug and love on, and then my 2-year-old just went to bed. So I was bouncing it on and off the calls was because I was either juggling a kid in my arms or telling one good night, or I actually had a break to eat with my family for a second. So I have 2 little girls.
Thanks for sharing your night with us, Jared. All of you guys.
Let's see. I like to paint and play music. So there you go. Sometimes. And
I was about to say, you've got it right behind you, pointing to it, the easel.
Yeah, if you want to get a little glimpse of John's artistic ability, go watch our Taco Tuesday videos on our Facebook page at Fleur de Title St. Tammany, and you'll hear John do a little jingle.
And also watch them stuff their face with tacos every Tuesday. Bob, what about you?
So, well, one of my hobbies is actually drinking beer, but not to excess. I actually like to craft beers, and I travel around the country and try different beers.
Nice.
And a couple of weeks ago, I tracked everything on Untapped. I don't know if you guys heard of that app. I hit 1,000 unique beers on that. So, and I try to drink a unique beer every day, or try something new every day. It gets harder. I now go into bars that have 50 beers on tap, and I've had them all. I can't find anything new a lot of times, so that's interesting. So it's fun. So I love traveling around the country, and the great thing is there's so many craft beer breweries that are opening up everywhere. I used to brew beer at home. I, you know, as a little home brewer, and did that, and actually went to the ATF and said, what I need to do to set up my own brewery. And they said, you need to have a commercial place. You can't brew it in your bathtub. I said, well, I brew it in my kitchen, not in the bathtub. He said, still doesn't count. You got to have a
Doesn't
commercial
count.
building. We're going to come, but we're going to come inspect it. So it's like, that stopped me from going into the beer business. But
Oh,
yeah,
darn.
that's a fun hobby.
If
Oh,
you know
well,
anything about building relationships, I'm gonna be I'll remember that for your birthday. I'll send you some. I'll at least try to get you a unique beer. I probably won't succeed, but I'll try.
that's huge
I
because
appreciate
I
it.
was thinking the same exact thing. That like, hey, now I know a thing I can get Bob right in the future. I can get him a unique beer or something, or but he might probably have tried it. But look, you guys, thank you, Jared, John, Bob, for sharing again. Continue to educate our community. To all you guys who attended, thank you so much for sticking with us on a Tuesday night. I hope to see you on Thursday. And look, this has been recorded. It's going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you've missed some of our past events, maybe you want some to go revisit some past speakers with some downtime, or maybe on your next run or bike ride, check it out on just Google, Northshore REIA on YouTube. And look, guys, although this wasn't specific CPA or legal advice, hopefully this gave you a big overall view of some things of way you could, grow your business. Thank you, guys. Have a fantastic night. We'll see you at the next webinar.
Good job.
Bye,
Thanks,
guys.
Courtney. Bye.
Thanks.